My mother texted me 40 minutes before I walked across that stage. The message said, "Don't mention the scholarship during dinner, people will think we couldn't afford to send you ourselves." I had just landed back in the country after 14 months, embedded with a trauma surgery unit in a combat support hospital overseas. 48 hours earlier, I had been keeping a 23-year-old corporal alive on an operating table, with no backup and one functioning suction unit. And my mother's biggest concern was what her book club friends would think about financial aid. Funny thing is, the second I walked into that auditorium, every single attending physician in that room stood up from their seats. Someone near the back shouted my name and my title. The applause started before I even reached the podium, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up standing in the corner of my own recognition ceremony while my family sat in the front row pretending I didn't exist. Before I get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever worked yourself half to death for people who couldn't be bothered to notice, hit like and subscribe. This one's for you. I'm 29 years old. My name is Sawyer, and I am a trauma surgeon, not the kind that takes on cosmetic work between golf rounds. The kind that gets called in at 2 in the morning when someone is bleeding from places blood isn't supposed to come from. I did my residency at a level 1 trauma center, then took a fellowship with an international medical nonprofit that places physicians in conflict zones. I have operated in field hospitals in sub-Saharan Africa and on a forward operating base in a region I am still not fully cleared to name. I have kept alive people who had no business surviving. I have also lost people I fought for with everything I had. That kind of work strips away every single thing that isn't real. My family lives in real estate. My father is a commercial developer. He built strip malls and mixed-use retail spaces for 30 years, and made a very comfortable living doing it. My mother managed the social calendar that came with that living. They belong to a country club outside of Nashville. They have opinions about wine vintages and vacation destinations and the right kind of law school. And they have spent the better part of my adult life quietly embarrassed that their oldest daughter chose to spend her 20s elbow deep in someone else's emergencies instead of building what they called a real life. My younger sister, Presley, is a real estate agent. She photographs beautifully. She posts a lot about her listings and her fiancé's lake house and her golden retriever, whose name I have been told but keep forgetting. My parents funded her down payment on a condo she uses as a staging property. They co-signed her business loan when her first brokerage didn't work out. They drove 4 hours to attend her headshot session. I am not exaggerating. When I matched into my residency program, my father sent a text that said, "Proud of you," followed by a period, no exclamation mark. The period was doing a lot of work. I had been back stateside for exactly 6 days when my mother called to tell me about the dinner. The hospital I had just formally accepted a position with, a research and trauma center affiliated with Vanderbilt, had arranged a small recognition event. The department chief had applied, on my behalf, and without my knowledge, for a federal designation called the Distinguished Civilian Service Commendation, given to medical professionals who complete deployment-adjacent service in high-risk humanitarian zones. Apparently, the paperwork had been sitting in some office for 8 months and had finally come through. The hospital wanted to make a thing of it. My mother heard recognition dinner and black tie and immediately called me to discuss logistics, not to ask how I was doing after 14 months away, not to ask whether I was sleeping or eating or adjusting to being home. She called to tell me that she and my father would be bringing Presley and Presley's fiancé, Hutton, and that she hoped I understood that Hutton's family would also be attending because his father was a significant donor to the hospital foundation. And this was simply how these things worked. I had never met Hutton's father. I knew of him the way you know of weather systems, as something large and approaching. His name was Montgomery. He had made a substantial fortune in pharmaceutical distribution and had since pivoted into medical philanthropy, the kind that comes with naming rights on buildings. My mother had been carefully cultivating a relationship with his wife for 8 months. She had mentioned this in 3 separate phone calls without once asking me a single question about my deployment. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday. I spent Friday getting my only formal dress dry cleaned and buying a new pair of shoes because the ones I'd shipped home had a broken heel I hadn't gotten around to fixing. That evening my mother came by my apartment. I was subletting a place from a colleague while I looked for something more permanent. And she walked through the door, looked me up and down and said, "You look tired." I told her I was tired. 14 months in a combat support hospital will do that. She sat down on my couch without being invited and started talking about the seating arrangement. Hutton's family was being placed at the primary table. She and my father and Presley and Hutton were also at the primary table. She explained, with a kind of elaborate casualness, that the hospital had arranged the seating by donor tier and family relationship, and it was simply a logistical reality that I would be seated at the secondary table, with some of my colleagues and a few board members I didn't know. She said she hoped I understood. I asked her where the secondary table was in relation to the stage. She said it was the table near the back by the kitchen service doors. I sat with that for a moment. The recognition dinner was for me. I was the reason anyone was there. And my mother had coordinated with the event planner to move me to the back of the room so that her table, with the donor family, with her daughter the real estate agent, and the fiancé with the lake house, would be the one closest to the stage and the cameras. I told her that seemed strange. She told me that Montgomery's foundation was a significant partner to the hospital and that these relationships required careful management, and that I had been away for a long time and didn't fully understand how things worked in this community anymore. She said it with the patient, slightly condescending tone she reserved for explaining things she thought were beyond me. I didn't argue. I had just come home from a place where argument was a luxury nobody had time for. I told her I understood and I would see her tomorrow. After she left, I sat in my kitchens for a long time. I thought about a night 6 months into my deployment when we had incoming casualties and no anesthesiologist, and I made a judgment call that I had to defend to 3 separate oversight bodies afterward. I had defended it. I had been right. And I had done it entirely alone, in the dark, with inadequate equipment and 2 nurses who had been awake for 20 hours. I thought about my mother explaining donor tiers to me, like I was a misbehaving child who didn't understand room layout. I texted my department chief that night, not to complain, just because we had been in close contact since I got back and he had a habit of checking in. I mentioned the seating situation. He read the message. He didn't respond right away. The dinner was at a hotel ballroom downtown. I arrived early, the way I always arrive everywhere, because punctuality is the one discipline that followed me home from deployment without needing any adjustment. I was wearing the dry-cleaned dress and the new shoes, and I had done my hair, which took longer than I remembered because I had spent the last year keeping it pinned back under a surgical cap. The ballroom was large and arranged formally, round tables with white linen and tall floral centerpieces, a raised stage at the front with a podium and a projection screen, soft lighting that was doing its best to be elegant. Hospital administration staff were moving around with clipboards. Photographers were adjusting lighting near the stage. My secondary table was, in fact, adjacent to the kitchen service door. I could hear the catering staff on the other side of the wall. The centerpiece at my table was noticeably smaller than the ones at the primary tables. I don't know if that was intentional or just coincidence, but I clocked it immediately. I found my place card, sat down, and introduced myself to the 2 colleagues who arrived shortly after me. They were both attendings in the department I was joining. One of them, a vascular surgeon named Theo. Wait, I need different names, let me think. One of them was a vascular surgeon, I'll call Dr. Arlen, and the other was an emergency medicine physician, I'll call Dr. Winslow. They were warm and funny, and both clearly confused about why I was sitting at the back table when my name was on the program as the evening's honoree. I told them I didn't design the seating chart. Dr. Arlen looked at the primary table near the stage, where my mother was already seated between my sister Presley and a woman I assumed was Montgomery's wife, based on the jewelry. He looked back at me. He didn't say anything, but his expression said several things. My father arrived a few minutes later. He shook my hand. He actually shook my hand like we were closing a business deal. He told me I looked well. I told him thank you. He went to find his seat at the primary table. Presley came in with Hutton. She was wearing a gown I'm fairly certain cost more than my first month's resident salary. She looked genuinely beautiful, and I registered that thought the way you register neutral information. She looked beautiful. The centerpieces were tall. The kitchen was loud. She gave me a quick hug and said, "So exciting, right?" in a tone that made it clear she didn't really want a response, and then she was gone, pulled away by Hutton toward the front of the room. I had not seen my sister in 14 months. That was the entire reunion. Hutton's father, Montgomery, arrived with the kind of entrance that happens when a room knows someone important has walked in. He was a large man, formal bearing, white hair, the kind of face that has spent decades at the heads of tables. He moved through the room shaking hands, and people leaned toward him when he spoke. My mother appeared at his elbow almost immediately and began guiding him toward the primary table with the careful efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this moment. Montgomery paused once, near the center of the room, and looked around the space with the slow, assessing gaze of a person who is accustomed to evaluating rooms. His eyes passed over the tables, the stage, the arrangement of guests. For just a moment his gaze landed on me, at the back table by the kitchen door. I looked back at him steadily. He moved on, guided by my mother. The dinner service began. I ate my salad and talked to my colleagues about a research study one of them was running. It was a genuinely good conversation. Dr. Arlen had a theory about delayed surgical intervention in penetrating abdominal trauma that I found immediately interesting, and we got deep enough into the mechanics of it that I almost forgot where I was sitting for about 20 minutes. Then the speeches started. The hospital president spoke first. He was gracious and thorough. He talked about the hospital's partnership with the non-profit that had placed me overseas. He mentioned the number of patients served, the operational conditions, the scope of the deployment. He was doing the thing that administrators do, where they describe the institution's role in something that the individual actually did alone in difficult circumstances, but I had no complaint with the content. He was setting context. Then my father asked for the microphone. I did not know this was happening. It was not on the program. He stood at the primary table and the host, confused but compliant, handed over the mic. My father adjusted his jacket, smiled at the room, and delivered what I can only describe as a commercial for our family. He talked about Presley's listings and her engagement and the beautiful lake house Hutton had renovated. He talked about his own development projects and mentioned twice the name of a mixed-use property he'd recently broken ground on. He mentioned my name once at the end as an afterthought. Said something about every family needing someone willing to do the difficult work that nobody else wants, and that he was grateful I had found a calling that suited my particular temperament. My particular temperament. He handed back the mic to a smattering of polite applause and sat down looking satisfied. I gripped the edge of the linen tablecloth and breathed slowly the way I breathe before I make a cut in tissue that doesn't forgive hesitation. Presley took out her phone and took a selfie with Hutton. I watched her caption it in real time. She used a heart emoji. The hospital president returned to the podium and was about to introduce the formal portion of the evening when I felt my phone vibrate in my lap. Once long, then twice short. It was the emergency contact pattern I had set up with my department chief 14 months ago, when we were still coordinating my logistics overseas. I had never updated it because I hadn't needed to. I looked down at my phone under the table. The message was from him. It said, "Coming in, 2 minutes, hold where you are." I read it twice. Then I set my phone down, face down on my thigh, and looked at the stage with the calm, particular focus I use when something large is about to happen, and I need all of my available attention. The ballroom doors at the back of the room opened. They didn't open dramatically. There was no crash, no announcement. They just opened the way doors open when someone with complete authority decides it's time. The catering manager near the service entrance turned around and went still. One of the photographers lowered his camera and stared. My department chief walked in first. He was wearing his formal hospital whites, the coat reserved for board presentations and official ceremonies. Behind him came the hospital's chief of medicine. Behind her came the director of the trauma fellowship program. Behind them came attending physicians, residents, fellows, nurses who had worked my intake cases in the first week I was back. They filed in with the quiet, organized efficiency of people who have spent their careers moving through emergencies without wasting motion. There were 63 of them. I found out afterward. I didn't count in the moment. In the moment I was focused on keeping my face neutral. They positioned themselves along the walls of the ballroom in a loose perimeter, the way my team used to secure a room before a briefing. They were not aggressive. They were not disruptive. They simply took up the space with a presence that made everyone already in the room suddenly aware that the room had changed. My mother turned in her seat and saw them. The carefully composed expression she had been wearing all evening, the one calibrated for Montgomery's benefit, slipped. She looked at my father. My father looked at the wall of white coats and then looked at the back table where I was sitting, and I watched his face do something I had never seen it do before. It went uncertain. Presley put her phone down. The hospital president at the podium paused mid-sentence and looked out at the room. Then he looked at my department chief, who had positioned himself near the back wall. My department chief gave a small, deliberate nod. The hospital president straightened. He cleared his throat. He spoke with a steadiness that I will be grateful for a long time. Before we proceed with the formal recognition, he said, I want to take a moment to address something that has come to my attention regarding this evening's arrangements. It has been brought to my notice that our honoree, the physician whose service we are all here to recognize tonight, has been seated at the rear of this room away from her family, adjacent to the kitchen. The room went very still. I want to be clear, the president continued, that this does not reflect the values of this institution, and it will not stand for the remainder of this evening. He looked directly at me. Dr. Sawyer, would you please come to the stage? I stood up. I walked from the back of the room to the front of the room in the kind of silence that has weight. I was aware of the cameras. I was aware of my family at the primary table. I was aware of Montgomery watching from his seat. I kept my eyes on the stage and I walked with the same economy of motion I use when I'm moving between a patient and a crash cart. No wasted steps, no performance, just getting to where I need to be. I stepped onto the stage. My department chief moved from the back wall to the front of the room. He climbed the two steps to the stage and stood beside the president. He was carrying a folder. He opened it. 14 months ago, he said, we sent one of our best to a combat support hospital operating under conditions I want this room to understand. His voice was steady and precise, the voice of someone who has delivered difficult news in hospital corridors and learned to make the words carry without breaking. No reliable power supply. Intermittent sterile water. A surgical team that at full strength consisted of 2 physicians and 4 nurses, and was on multiple documented occasions reduced to 1 physician and 2 nurses due to illness and field casualties among support staff. Montgomery had turned in his seat to face the stage fully. He was not looking at my family. He was looking at the stage. In those conditions, my department chief continued, Dr. Sawyer performed 211 surgical procedures. Of those, 189 patients survived. In an environment where the international standard for survival in comparable trauma settings runs below 60%, she achieved an 89.6 survival rate. Someone at a table near the center made a sound, not words, just a sound. 3 of those procedures were performed during active security incidents, without the ability to pause or evacuate. 1 was performed with a failing generator by flashlight held by a nurse on a patient who would not have survived transport to an alternative facility. He paused. That patient went home to his family 4 weeks later. I looked out at the room. I was not going to cry. I had not cried once in 14 months and I was not going to start here, not in this ballroom, not with the kitchen door 20 feet behind me and my mother's face doing something complicated in the 4th row. The Distinguished Civilian Service Commendation, my department chief said, is awarded by the Department of Defense in recognition of exceptional service to the United States in a civilian capacity. It is not awarded often. It is not awarded lightly. Tonight, it is awarded to someone whose work saved lives that no one in this room, myself included, would have been capable of saving under those circumstances. He closed the folder. He looked at me. I want to say one more thing before we proceed, he said, dropping the formality and speaking the way he speaks when it's just the department and we're debriefing after something hard. I was informed earlier today of the seating arrangement that had been made for this evening. I want to say, for the record, and in front of everyone present, that the physician standing on this stage deserves every seat of honor in every room she walks into for the rest of her career. The fact that she walked to the back of this room and sat down without a word of complaint is not evidence that she doesn't notice. It's evidence of who she is. He stepped back. The room was quiet. Then Montgomery stood up. He didn't stand up the way people stand up to be seen. He stood up the way people stand up when something demands a physical response. He was at the primary table right next to my mother, and when he rose she had to lean back to avoid being in his way. He looked at the stage, he looked at me, and then he began to clap. It wasn't the polite event-appropriate applause of a donor at a hospital function. It was the applause of someone who had just witnessed something real and was responding to it in the only way immediately available to him. The room followed. The 63 physicians and nurses along the walls began to applaud. The hospital staff joined in. The tables in the center of the room joined in. It moved from the walls inward and from the front of the room backward, and within about 15 seconds the only people in the room not applauding were the 4 people sitting at the primary table near the stage. My mother had her hands in her lap. My father was staring at the tablecloth. Presley was looking at Hutton. Hutton was looking at his grandfather. Montgomery was still standing. He stopped applauding and he looked at my family with an expression I recognized immediately. Because I have worn it myself in clinical settings, when I am looking at something that requires an honest assessment rather than a diplomatic one. He sat back down slowly and leaned toward Hutton and said something I couldn't hear from the stage. Whatever it was, Hutton's face changed. The formal presentation happened after that. The commendation itself was a framed certificate and a medallion, not a large object, not a flashy one, but the weight of it when the hospital president placed it in my hands was something I felt in my sternum. I said a few words. I meant them. I thanked my colleagues by name and I thanked the nurses I had served with overseas, and I said that the survival rate statistic was not mine. It belonged to everyone who had stood in that field hospital and made decisions in the dark. I did not thank my family. It wasn't a pointed omission. There was simply nothing to thank them for in relation to what was being recognized. Thanking them would have been inaccurate, and accuracy matters. After the formal program during the reception, I was standing with Dr. Arlen and 2 of the nurses when Montgomery crossed the room toward me. He moved through the crowd with a deliberate unhurriedness and people made way without being asked. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. "Dr. Sawyer," he said, "I owe you an apology." I told him he didn't owe me anything personally. "My family's name is on 3 buildings in this hospital," he said. "That comes with a level of influence over events like this one that I did not exercise appropriately tonight. I should have asked more questions about the arrangements." He paused. "I did not know you were sitting at the back of the room until your chief spoke. I want you to know that." I told him I believed him. "I also want you to know," he said, "that I have a foundation that funds surgical fellowships in exactly the kinds of environments where you spent the last 14 months. We have been looking for someone to lead the clinical advisory board for 2 years. I would like to have that conversation with you if you're willing." I said I was willing. He nodded once with the brevity of someone who considers a thing settled once it's agreed to, and then he looked past my shoulder toward the primary table, where my mother had been watching this exchange with an expression caught between hope and terror. He looked back at me. "Your family is very proud of your sister's real estate career," he said. It wasn't a question. I said that was accurate. He said, in a way that contained a complete paragraph, and then excused himself. My mother found me 20 minutes later, near the bar. She was carrying a glass of white wine and she had reapplied her lipstick and she had the expression she uses when she is about to reframe something that didn't go the way she planned. "That was a beautiful ceremony," she said. "We are so proud of you." I looked at her. "Your father and I have always been proud of you. We just don't always know how to show it. You know how he is." I did know how he was. I had spent 29 years knowing how he was. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice even the way I keep it, even when I'm delivering news that is going to change some children's understanding of their situation, "I need you to hear what I'm about to say." She tilted her head in the way that means she is preparing to not hear it. "You moved me to the back of the room," I said. "At my own recognition dinner. You coordinated with the event planner to make sure I was out of the camera frame so that Presley and Hutton could be in the front row. That is what happened tonight. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen and I'm not going to let you explain it away." She started to say something about donor relationships and table tiers and logistics. "I kept 89% of my patients alive," I said quietly, "in a building with no reliable electricity during active security incidents by myself for 14 months. I did that without a single phone call from you asking if I was okay. Not one, Mom, not in 14 months. My voice did not shake. "I am not angry, I am past angry. I am just telling you clearly, the way I would tell a patient clearly, that things between us cannot continue the way they have been. I love you. And I am done being managed, she cried. Real tears this time, which I recognized immediately as distinct from the performance ones she had been running earlier. I did not comfort her. Not because I didn't feel anything, I felt a great deal, but because comfort at that moment would have undone the only honest conversation we had ever had, and she deserved the honesty more than she deserved the comfort. My father approached. He had clearly seen the conversation and calculated his arrival time to occur after the hardest part was over, which was consistent with his lifelong practice. He put his hand on my mother's shoulder and looked at me with an expression that was working very hard to be warm. That was impressive up there, he said. Really impressive. I thanked him. I hope you know the things I said. The way I phrased things earlier, I just thought it would be more appropriate to keep the focus on the hospital, not make it too personal. You said I had a calling that suited my particular temperament, I said, in front of Montgomery's family and the hospital board. At my recognition dinner, he opened his mouth, closed it. I want to have a real relationship with you, I said, both of you. But I can't build one on a foundation where that's considered acceptable. So I'm going to go back to my colleagues and enjoy the rest of this evening, and then next week, when things are quieter, I would like to have a real conversation, just the three of us. No events, no donors, no managing impressions. I looked at my father. Can we do that? He was quiet for a moment, and then for the first time in my memory he said yes, I think we should. It wasn't a transformation, it wasn't a dramatic collapse of arrogance or a tearful admission of failure. It was a small, quiet yes from a man who had spent 30 years being large and loud and had just, in the span of 90 minutes, been reduced to the accurate size of himself. That was enough, for now. That was enough. I went back to my colleagues. Dr. Arlen had found a decent bottle of Cabernet at the bar and poured me a glass without being asked. The conversation about penetrating abdominal trauma picked back up as if we had never left it. And for the next hour I stood in the middle of a room full of people who actually understood what the last 14 months had cost me. And I felt, for the first time since I'd landed back on American soil, that I was exactly where I belonged. The greatest thing a field hospital teaches you is the difference between what is urgent and what is important. Urgent things demand your immediate attention. Important things determine whether the urgent things were worth surviving. My career is important. The 89% is important. The 63 people who walked into a hotel ballroom on a Saturday night because they believed I deserved better. They are important. The front row of a room is just geography. What matters is who stands up when your name is called. And now I know, with a certainty I didn't have before, exactly who those people are.